Right. First thing the question is asking you is to what extent. So you need to underline and box the word extent. Now, the word extent is asking you to make a judgment. So you have to reach a conclusion at the end. So you need to make a judgment. Now, when you're making a judgment, you need to basically decide whether it absolutely is or it absolutely is not. Now, you can say, I think to a great extent it is, or to a great extent it isn't, but you need to make that conclusion, you need to make that judgment. So it absolutely is true or absolutely is not true. I'll come to that in a bit.
Has this got sound bits?
Yeah.
So they can hear us?
Yeah. I can turn the sound off though. But I think it'll be more beneficial. I think it'll be more beneficial to you guys if I can leave the sound on. So that's your choice. Now, the question is saying, so to what extent you're making a judgment whether it is or it isn't impossible. So that's where the question is confusing because it's a negative. So the question is saying, is it absolutely impossible to prevent floods in Carlisle, or is it not impossible to prevent floods in Carlisle? And this is where you have to make the choice. Now the question says, use evidence from the graph, fact box and the map. Now for this extent question, yes? No? For this extent question, where you're reaching a judgment, for you to be able to get into the level 2, level 3 and level 4, which is the 8 marks, you need to have a balanced argument. A balanced appraisal is the way that it's worded in the mark scheme. So you need to make sure that you look at both sides. So you look at both sides of the argument. So I want you to consider that when you're reaching a judgment. Now this is the case for all extent questions, not just this one.
Are we writing this?
Yes.
Reaching a judgment.
Oh, poo.
Wait, do you write that?
Write everything that I'm writing.
So I already wrote the bit at the top that says make a judgment whether yes or no.
Now, because this is the common problem. Exactly. This is a common problem with this exam type question, is that people don't consider both sides. And if you don't consider both sides, you're limiting yourself to only being able to access half the marks, regardless of what your answer is, because in the mark scheme it says you have to have a balanced appraisal. Therefore, you need to consider both sides. Yes, Sam?
Do we do like 2 4 games to like conclusion?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. And I'm going to show you how to do that.
So it's not a balanced argument, it's a more on my own.
You can have a one-sided opinion, but you have to consider how it might be considered different to somebody else.
Okay.
So it's a bit like if you're in English writing a persuasive letter and you look at the other person's opinion, but then you say, well, no, I disagree with that because...
9 mark crib sheet.
I don't know what that is.
Oh.
Okay.
I looked at both sides, but I still only got 1 mark. I don't understand how that works.
Well, listen, and then I'll tell you. Now, what you have to do next, or what I would do next if I was being given this question, is I would have a look at the evidence in front of me that I could use to help me answer this question. Now, these 8 mark questions, the whole point of them, I'm going to give up in a minute, I really am. The whole point of these is to link your knowledge and understanding. So you can't simply just pick parts of the evidence as your answer. Yes, it shows that you're using the evidence in front of you, and a lot of people didn't use the evidence in front of them, but you have to link together the understanding of the evidence with your knowledge. So there has to be evidence that you've understood it and you've learned things about it, and your knowledge has to be in this answer. So I'm going to put the evidence has to link together your knowledge and understanding. Your knowledge of the topic and understanding of the evidence.
You write these little sentences in the exam. No, let me finish. Shut up.
In the exam. Good question. I wouldn't write everything that I'm writing now, but what I definitely would do is I would do the parts where you're annotating the question.
Do you get a mark for that?
No, but if you're running out of time and you have a plan in place, it's better than leaving it blank. I would annotate the question, and you can make smaller notes around the question. You won't need to do it in such depth, because hopefully, if we do this enough, it will become common enough for it to just sort of trigger, right, extent means reach a judgment. Reach a judgment means a balanced argument. If you're being asked to use evidence, make sure that you do use the evidence. Now we're going to start answering the question. I'm not going to write it in full sentences. I'm going to show you how you use the evidence, what the evidence means, and then how you could actually construct this into an answer. So the first piece of evidence we're going to look at is the map. So map 2, all of you should have that in your exam paper. Now this map, what's it showing? It's showing rainfall. Okay, map 2 is showing rainfall. It's showing rainfall over 2 days. Okay. Now, what the map is actually showing you, the place that you're looking at in the question is Carlisle. So you have to look at what it's telling you about Carlisle. In Carlisle, the rainfall is actually quite low.
When it says like rainfall over 2 days, does that mean where it says 189, does it mean 189 millimeters?
Yes.
Oh,
Okay, compared to the Lake District. Now you know it's the Lake District because on the first page the area in the highest land shows you that that's the Lake District. So you can see in Carlisle it's relatively low because it's 54, but if you look at the Lake District it goes up to as high as 405. So in comparison that is not anywhere near as high. So this is your first piece of evidence. Okay, the rainfall in Carlisle is low and the highest rainfall is the Lake District, and you can quote that, you can use the evidence for that. So you can say that's at 405 millimetres. Now this is just in 2 days. Now this is where you link this evidence to your knowledge. Okay, now how this links to the question about preventing flooding in Carlisle, what you have to be able to do at this point is you have to be able to say, right, I know then that because the Lake District is 400 metres above, the land is of that height, you know also from the first question that this is where the source of your river is, you know that this is the upper course of your river because they are always in the mountainous areas with the higher land, so you know that. And what you can tell from this is that this upper course of the river is where your floodwater's coming from. So perhaps it's actually the upper course of the river that needs to be managed rather than just preventing just managing the areas in Carlisle. And that is just from this one piece of evidence. So from that, I would then say this suggests
You need to read out loud as you write.
yeah, so I say this suggests that the upper drainage basin
Drainage basin is a whole thing, isn't it?
needs the upper part though. I'm just talking about the upper part. Needs to, because it doesn't mention any management in the Lake District.
But it does in Carlisle.
In Carlisle, yes, which is the lower course. You can see that from the map. Carlisle, you can see, is right next to the mouth because the Solway Firth, which is your sea, you know that that's the mouth of the river, so you know that that's much flatter from the map.
It's not flooding at the top of the river, so why should we manage it?
Because it's the water that's coming from that top area is flowing down.
Because it's going quickly down, and when it gets to the flat ground in Carlisle,
Exactly.
because too much water is coming
Exactly.
in, it's flowing out.
Exactly. You got it.
Knowledge.
Right. Shh.
I'll kill you. You die.
So this suggests that the upper drainage basin needs to be managed because this is where the majority of your floodwater is coming from. Okay, and we know this. So our knowledge here.
How would you do that?
What?
How can you manage the upper drainage basin? You can't really.
Make it
You could raise the embankments, so you could raise the embankments levels, which would be really expensive. But you could also suggest implementing more soft engineering, so just simply planting more trees, that sort of thing. Which exactly, yeah. So for this question, you don't need to go into detail on how you would do it, but you just need to recognise that it's something that would need to happen. So your knowledge is that you're not told. Can you stop talking, because you're not even supposed to sit there and you're just literally constantly chatting. And I've managed to do I've hardly done any of this question at the moment. I don't mind chatting about it. I don't mind answering questions. But if you're just talking, then leave, because it's wasting time.
Yes. But then I'll be able to make a runoff river type thing towards the sea, takes a different route.
Don't worry about how. You just need to know that it needs to be.
Oh.
Okay, so your knowledge is the fact that the the upper course of the river.
Yeah, I know, but because the question says to prevent the floods, that is a way of preventing it. I'm just giving a solution to.
Yes, but for this question you don't need to, and you wouldn't get marks
Oh,
for
so you
doing
don't
it.
need to write anything about how to stop it at all.
No, just write what I'm telling you to write.
Oh, stupid.
Because the question is, to what extent is it impossible? It's not asking you how would you prevent floods in Carlisle, or how could the river in Carlisle be managed to prevent floods. It's saying to what extent is it possible or not.
Yeah,
And these are your reasons why. No, just literally focus on what I'm saying. The upper course of the river, this is your knowledge. You know it's the upper course because it's the highest ground. So the Lake District is over 400 metres, which is the highest land on the map. You can see that Carlisle is is the lower course.
So would you put all this in the...
Yep. Yep. Carlisle is the lower course, and you can see that because it's right next to the mouth. It's right next to the sea. Ollie, can you please just let me finish it? Because we're going through it step by step, and it makes it much more difficult if you're questioning everything that I'm doing. I'm telling you how to get full marks in this question.
Surely you've not stated whether it's...
I've literally got to my first point, and that is it. I've got like 5 more points to tell you about, and I'm just not getting through it at the moment. Why don't you just let me finish and then ask how this gets you the marks? We probably won't finish it this lesson at the rate we're going. I'm not going to upload this video, no, because I think it's a little bit embarrassing the amount of times that people have interrupted me. So no, I'm not going to upload it. I'm not going to. The only ones that I think will be beneficial is if I sit here and record them on my own, which I will do for the benefit of people who will watch it. But it just means I have to do it several times. Right, so for people who are struggling then, let's go through what we've gone through, what we've got so far. So your question, to what extent, so you're making a judgment, is it absolutely impossible or could it be possible to prevent floods in Carlisle? You have to use the evidence and you have to link it to things you already know. Now, you don't necessarily have to write here, in this question, you don't necessarily have to write this within your response. But what it shows me is that if you're able to suggest the reason that this area is flooding so badly is because the rainfall in the upper course of the drainage basin, you know that the upper courses flow into the lower courses. So it demonstrates to me that you have this knowledge. If you say that the rainfall over the 2 days being so high in the Lake District in the upper drainage basin, it suggests to me that you know that this is the highest ground and it will flow down to the mouth of the river, which is located near the sea, which is where Carlisle is. So you don't necessarily have to explicitly say that because that implies that you have that knowledge. But what you would have to do is make these points from the evidence that's there about the map. Okay, so that's the first thing that I would consider. So what you could suggest is that the upper drainage basin is the part of the river that needs to be managed, and it doesn't say that it is within the fact box. The next thing that you can look at is the graph. Now the graph, there was a 6-mark question about the graph earlier on in the paper that some people did okay on. Many people simply did not make enough comparisons to get anywhere near the 6 marks. This graph is actually a river hydrograph, okay, because it's showing you the river levels, which is what hydrographs do. I've not spelled that right. Sorry. Now this is a river hydrograph. It's showing you the amount of water that's in your river. When you're looking at the hydrograph, which you can do as I go through it, you can see here that during the time that they're talking about in the fact box, during the winter of 2015-2016, you can see that it rose several times and it was quite unstable. That's your piece of evidence that you can write about the river flood at the moment. So river discharge, which we all know is how much water is in your river. Gary, you need to write this. Rose several times during the winter of 2015 to 2016. Now that's important because this is when the major flood happened, and you can say that peak discharge rose to, I would just put 7 metres, 6 to 7 metres is fine as well. Now what you can see from the graph as well, let me show you if I can find it, is that here in this graph, this is the period of time that we're talking about this flood taking place. You can see here that there is a very, very steep rise. It's quite dramatic. Now, what we call that, and what we do know with hydrographs with that, is that it's called our rising limb. I did not see the word rising limb in anyone's answers or anyone's response at all. So that's what we need to focus on, is putting in our keywords. So from this graph, your other piece of evidence is that it rose several times. The rising limb, yep.
I was not understanding how it's saying like that the river discharge grew and like how like the high ground and low ground has anything to do with how impossible it is to stop them.
Because they're factors that are simply could be considered as being beyond our control. So the rising limb rose steeply. Now this is what's important. If it's rising so steeply, what does that suggest? Heavy rainfall, yes, we know that. But what, sorry? So the rising limb is the part where the river discharge is increasing after. You can see it literally on that. You know, we've done hydrographs, haven't we? And so this would be, we did a whole lesson on it, and this would be your falling limb where it's falling back down, or receding limb, and this is your rising limb. So you have a rising limb on this one. On this one, it doesn't show you where the rainfall is happening, but it's rising because of the rainfall. Now, what can happen is if your drainage basin can handle a lot of rainfall, if it's able to handle a lot of rainfall, this line may not rise so steeply. What it might do is it might rise like this. Now, what factors are there in a drainage basin that could affect how quickly the water runs? Yeah. Geology, yes.
Size and vegetation.
Those two things, perfect. Instantly, straight away. So what your graph is showing you is it's showing you that we know there was this period of heavy rainfall from the map, and what's happening is that rainfall is going very, very quickly over the surface. And we know that from that we can tell, right, the geology must mean that the surfaces are impermeable, because that rainwater is travelling so quickly from the upper course to the lower course and flooding Carlisle so badly. So that would be your next step. The rising limb rose steeply, and again, this is where our knowledge comes in. This isn't in the evidence, this is your knowledge. This suggests that the geology of the drainage basin is impermeable. Now, if it's impermeable, what does that do to surface runoff?
Increases.
Exactly. And you can say this is because surface runoff is rapid. And you can tell that from your hydrograph. So if surface runoff is rapid, this suggests that there is a lack of infiltration, which is where water's going into the soil, and percolation, which is where water will go into the rocks. Now, as we go through the question, I'm hoping it will become clearer as to how this links in with the question. So, we know that actually because of this, because of the fact that geology is impermeable, and because of the fact that there is such heavy rainfall occurring in the Lake District in your upper courses, this is going to affect the lower course of your river. So we've looked at the graph. Now what we need to do is we need to look at the fact file. Okay, we'll keep the question here. So the fact file is the fact box that was given to you in your test paper. The fact file says things like this. It says about how Penrith has an average of this much rain for the whole month of December. Carlisle suffered severe floods. It gives us our times, it tells us the damage, and it tells us that the flood defences were improved and that the severe floods only happen on average every 100 years. So your fact file, the first piece of information that I would take from that would be that the average rainfall. So from the fact file, I can see that the average rainfall in Penrith is 215 for the whole of December. Now straight away I can see that this amount of rainfall is exceptional because we have more rain than this falling in these areas over 2 days. So you can say rainfall in December 2015, which is the time that we're looking at, was exceptional. Okay, now because this is exceptional, we already know, or we've been told, that the defences have been improved. But if they've been improved, if this is only happening every 100 years, it may make it quite difficult for it to be impossible. So this is where you can move on to your counter argument. This is where you can say, actually, they may be capable because actually this should only happen once every 100 years. So the next thing that you can do is your counter argument.
How can they predict?
Exactly, it's very difficult.
If you know it's going to happen, surely you would...
It's very difficult.
You can't predict how much you can do.
So, because on the mark scheme it says that you can be rewarded for whichever opinion you go for. It says responses are likely to present an argument that it is impossible to prevent the most severe floods, and we can see that because of the amount of rainfall being exceptional. You can see that from the geology of the landscape and the fact that there's no upper course management. But it does say the counter argument may be that such events are very infrequent and flood defences are capable of preventing most floods, and we get that from the fact file. So your counter argument, you can link back to the fact file. You can say that the flood defences in Carlisle may be capable of preventing most floods. You can say that they were improved and that these flood events are very infrequent. So every 100 years. So that counter-argument sort of says, well, it is kind of possible because we've got flood defences in place, they've been improved, and this doesn't happen very often, so we should be okay with it. Now, what you can say in conclusion, I think, is you can sort of summarise and conclude whether to what extent you think it is or isn't impossible based on the things that you've said so far. So, in conclusion, I would say I think that most of our points that we've talked about so far, the fact that we've got management needed in the upper drainage basin, high levels of rainfall, the fact that it's unpredictable, the geology of the landscape and lack of infiltration, lack of percolation into the ground, I would say in conclusion, to a great extent, it is, impossible to prevent floods in Carlisle because, or due to the fact that although flood defences were improved, the geology of the drainage basin being impermeable, I would say the geology of the drainage basin being impermeable alongside exceptionally high rainfall, increasing surface runoff makes flooding difficult to prevent in Carlisle. You could say that flood defences in Carlisle alone are not enough to prevent flooding. You could say that I argue that management of the upper drainage basin could prove a more effective yet expensive solution. So that's very detailed, okay? There is a lot of information there.